welcome to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Jahnke. We just had 12 full games of football today. Had a great Sunday night football game with the Bengals and Chargers. Another interesting day for fantasy football. Definitely some players who had some of the best games we've seen in a while. Luckily, not a ton of injuries, just a couple of them to fantasy players. So we'll jump right into some of the most interesting things of the day. And we'll start with the Denver Broncos backfield, where Audric Estime was not the lead running back for Denver. Last week, we thought he would after he was the clear lead runner to start the game, had run 14 times compared to just one by Williams. But I did mention last week that I was a little bit concerned that this could be a hot hand thing where Estime just started playing well, so they kept giving him more carries. Since we didn't see him start the game last week, he didn't play for the first couple of drives. But we had thought because he played so well last week that he would continue to see those opportunities this week. This week, we did see Javonte Williams start the game. Estime came in for the second drive. So it seemed like they were going to be doing more of a rotation by drive to find out who got the hot hand. But the Broncos scored a touchdown on Williams' first drive. It was a 3-on-out at Estime's first drive, and then they scored again on Williams' second drive. So it was Williams who was more of the hot hand this game. Williams continued to be more of the lead back throughout the game, ran 19 carries, or 9 times for 59 yards, scored a touchdown, caught 4 passes for 28 yards, where Estime only 6 carries for 16 yards, had 3 receptions in this game, so it was good to see him get a little involved in the passing game this week. But it was clear that Williams was the better player this week, which wasn't great to see for anyone who spent a lot on Estime. I do think it is worth holding on to him because he has been the more elusive back so far this season. He's been the one who's broken the most big plays, at least on a per attempt basis. So I would not be surprised if it's still a hot hand thing. I don't think this automatically shifts things back to Williams being the main running back. The fact that Estime did play on the second drive was better than what we've seen in the other games so far this season. So it was a shift in the right direction for Estime getting more playing time, just not nearly as strong as we were hoping for anyone who picked him up in fantasy leagues. So I think it will be interesting to see what they do going forward. Estime still available in plenty of fantasy football leagues, and I still have him as one of the top couple waiver wire options at running back this week. Just because there's only a couple running backs who have the potential of being a starter the rest of the season without an injury to anyone else in the backfield. He's one of the few running backs who's available who at least has that path, but it really has not been a great time for anyone who needs a running back in fantasy football over the past month or so. We haven't had many injuries to the position. We haven't had many rookies who have earned their way into big roles. Estime seemed to be the one running back who had that opportunity, and it just didn't go his way this week, but it could very well change again next week. I think the Broncos will continue to let all 3 running backs see the field, and whoever is doing well will get the carries. And maybe if someone does well over the course of a couple games, maybe they earn that lead role for the rest of the season. Our next backfield situation I want to cover is the Las Vegas Raiders, where we saw 2 injuries to running backs. Zamir White left the game late in the third quarter. Alexander Madison then left later in the game. I think it was early in the fourth quarter. They were both ruled questionable at the same time, and then later in the game, near the end, Madison was ruled out for the game. So interesting what happened there, but I want to talk more about what happened earlier in the game. And that was Zamir White was kind of back to being that clear lead early down back for the Raiders. Over the first 3 quarters of the game, on first and second downs, he played 21 of a possible 29 snaps. So it was really back to White being the main early down running back for the Raiders. We had not seen that since early in the season, before he lost his job, both to an injury as well as ineffective play. So before White was injured in this game, it was back to him being the lead running back, even though he's been ineffective all season. And in this game, if we were to find out that White was perfectly fine, they just didn't bring him back to the game as a precaution, since they did not rule him out the same way they ruled Madison out. I think White would be one of the running backs to target on the waiver wire, even though we've seen his play so far this season. But like I said, with the Broncos running backs, there's only a couple running backs available on the waiver wire who have any shot of being a team's lead running back over the rest of the season. And White is one of those running backs. He did it this week. He didn't play well in those opportunities, but there's always a chance that he turns things around over this last third of the season. Once he went down with injury, we saw Madison kind of get back to that early down role. And then once Madison was out as well, Amir Abdullah was the only running back left on the active roster. So Abdullah took over as the lead running back the rest of the way. I do think there is an opportunity for Dylan Labe, who was a 6th round pick, who was hyped up a lot in August as someone who could have a big role in the preseason. He was rotating in with these guys a bit, especially in that second preseason game. I think if both running backs were to miss time, it would be Dylan Labe and not Amir Abdullah as the early down back. Abdullah, a special teams player as well as a receiving down back. So we saw in the preseason, Labe was playing a lot on early downs as well as third downs, where Abdullah was mostly just playing on third downs. Was a 2-minute drill for most of the time he was in the game this week. And throughout the season, he's really only seen playing time if the Raiders are down multiple scores and are trying to catch up. So I think this could be a situation similar to what we saw with the Chargers, where Gus Edwards was the clear number 2 running back. Then he suffered the injury, so Kamani Vidal, who was a healthy and active throughout the season, leapfrogged Hassan Haskins to be the number 2 running back. I think this can be a similar case where Alabe would leapfrog Amir Abdullah to be higher up on the depth chart. So I think he is also someone to consider off the waiver wire. I think we'll hopefully get more information about the injuries to these running backs over this next 48 hours or so we can be more informed about what we're doing off the waiver wire. But I think a lot of people will just look at the injuries and make a decision based off that, and not realize how involved White was earlier in this game. So I think it is important to note how involved White was in the backfield. Final running back situation I want to cover today, and that is the Cleveland Browns, where we saw Jerome Ford play the clear majority of snaps for the Browns backfield, twice as much as Nick Chubb played. When I first saw this, I thought a lot of this was game script related. And if you look at the graph, if you're able to see it, it was also pretty clear that a lot of it was game script related. They ran a ton of plays in 2-minute drills, and that's something where Nick Chubb hasn't traditionally played a lot. They also ran a decent number of snaps on third downs, another situation where Chubb has not played throughout his career. But there was a little bit of more of a mix on early downs than what I would have expected given the game script. Early in the first quarter, Chubb was playing a lot of those early down snaps, but in the second quarter, when the game was still within reach, within a touchdown or so, we saw Jerome Ford mixing in more on early downs. Over the first 5 drives, which is everything outside of the 2-minute drill in the first half, Chubb played 11 snaps to 6 by Ford and 1 by Pierre Strong. And even though that was a clear Chubb leading the way, it was a bit closer than what we would have expected. We saw a pretty similar thing 2 weeks ago where the Browns were still close within those first 5 drives, and Chubb had a much clearer lead in snaps at that time. And then it was, again, a case where Ford was playing more in the passing situation later. But it leads me to believe if the Browns are in a game where it's closer, we might see it still being more of a mix of snaps and mix of carries between Chubb and Ford, not just Chubb potentially getting to 15, 20 carries in a game. It seems like he is still limited. And even though he ran for more yards per carry in this game than what we've seen the last couple weeks, it was still a case where it doesn't seem like he's 100%. He isn't making as many big plays as we've seen throughout his career, not grading as well as we've seen throughout his career. It was kind of to be expected when he came back from injury. He would not be quite the same player, but it was still a case where it just wasn't, it hasn't been great so far this season. I probably wouldn't drop him at this point because he is still a clear lead running back, but I'm also not sure I see quite the scenario where I would trust him in my fantasy starting lineup over these next 6 weeks. So not great for anyone who drafted Chubb and was hoping to see him be a potential fantasy starter this year. Before I get to my next topics, which are 2 tight ends, do want to cover 2 questions that I have seen in the chat so far. One, would you trade away Tyreek Hill and Josh Downs for Kyren Williams? After this week where Tyreek and Downs had good games, Kyren a little bit of a down game, I probably would be fine making this trade. A lot completely depends on how good your running backs and other wide receivers are and where the strengths of your team are. But I think that is a pretty fair trade. I do like Tyreek the rest of the season. I like Downs in general, but I also think Kyren will continue to be one of the top couple running backs in the league over the rest of the season. So I probably more trust Kyren the rest of the year over Tyreek, where the schedule isn't great. But it was good to see Tyreek have a good game. It was good to see Downs have a good game as well. And Kyren, unfortunately, the rough game this week. Other one, hi Nate, how to assess the impact of Tony Pollard, CD Lamb, and TJ Hockenson. Lamb hasn't played yet. He plays on Monday Night Football. Generally think he'll play better than he did this past week. Had him as someone to trade for in your fantasy leagues. A lot of leagues now, the trade deadline's over, so you might not be able to trade for him, but generally fine with him. Tony Pollard did not have a great game this week. Was in his normal rotation with Tyjae Spears. Spears left the game early. Believe it was a concussion off the top of my head, but I'm not 100% there. But if he does miss time, then Pollard would go back to being a clear every down back, which was great to see. And then Hockenson still limited with the injury, which isn't great, but still probably a fantasy starter more often than not, especially with all the bye weeks upcoming for tight ends and the injuries we've had at tight end recently. So even though he's still been limited, Josh Oliver, the other main tight end in Minnesota, left the game early this week, and Hockenson did not really see an increase in snaps. Johnny Munt continued to kind of take the role of Josh Oliver over the rest of the game. So I think Hockenson is still pretty limited from coming back from injury. Hopefully sometime he starts to see more snaps, and he did see a lot of targets a week ago, not so much this week, but still generally guessing I'll have him among the top 12 rest of season tight ends. Last two situations I want to cover this week are at tight end. There were a couple interesting things at wide receiver, but not a ton that I wanted to cover, at least today. The first was the tight end situation for the Las Vegas Raiders. Brock Bowers had a career game for him, 13 receptions, 126 yards, and a touchdown. It was the most receptions by a rookie tight end in a game in NFL history. So that was clearly huge. But a couple of interesting things with the Raiders tight ends before this matchup. Michael Mayer, who had missed the last several weeks due to a personal matter, was able to return full participant in practice. Harrison Bryant, who had been the number 2 tight end, out this week with an ankle injury. The Raiders did not bring up a tight end off the practice squad or anything. So it was just the 2 tight ends, Bowers and Mayer. And we had seen early in the season that Michael Mayer, the former second-round pick, was seeing significant playing time and cutting into Bowers' playing time. Bowers was playing between 66 and 68% of snaps the first 3 weeks of the season. Then Mayer was out in week 4, which allowed Bowers to see an increase in snaps. Was consistently playing around 79 to 84% of snaps for a couple weeks there. And then really these past few weeks, the Raiders have trusted Bowers to stay on the field for more than he had been at any point in the season, playing over 90% of snaps the past few weeks. I did have a little bit of concern that with Mayer being back, we might see Bowers drop back down on snaps, but instead he went even higher in snaps, played 95% of the snaps, a new career high for him. So along with all of the career highs in receiving yards and receptions and whatnot, Bowers had a career high in snaps and route participation rate as well. So it was very good to see out of Bowers and his potential fantasy production going forward. A lot of tight ends have had pretty questionable roles, and it seemed like early in the season, even with Bowers playing very well as early as week 1, that his role could limit him at times. Now he's just in that clear-cut tight end who rarely leaves the field role, which is exactly what you want to see from a fantasy tight end, and can definitely add some confidence, not just for the rest of this year, but with how high Bowers could potentially be drafted in fantasy drafts next year when Travis Kelce is a year older, Mark Andrews is a year older, George Kittle's a year older. So there's not going to be quite as many clear top tight end options in a year from now. Bowers is going to be one of those, maybe one or two top clear options. And last situation I want to cover today, it's two things with the Chicago Bears. We had seen Shane Waldron get fired earlier in this last week. Waldron definitely had a clear style of how he liked to do things on offense. We've seen it with the Rams, with the Seahawks, and again with the Bears. And we had seen some clear shifts in how the Bears use their players this week compared to some past weeks. Roshan Johnson was more involved on offense this week. DeAndre Swift a little less involved. Swift 14 carries for 71 yards and a touchdown, so still played very well. But Roshan Johnson also reached double-digit carries, 33 yards and a touchdown, so very good to see Johnson get more involved. The big thing there was the early down, or not short yardage situations for the Bears. When they needed 1 or 2 or 3 yards to get a first down, it was Johnson who was consistently on the field. All but one of those snaps, it was Johnson running the ball, which is why Johnson had so many carries this week. Over the past several weeks, it had been roughly a 2-to-1 split, with Swift getting 2 carries or 2 snaps in short yardage situations for every 1 by Johnson. Typically, we see that vary a little bit from one week to another. Plenty of weeks where they're only in that situation 2 or 3 times a game. But this week, the Bears were very often in this situation where they only needed a couple of yards for a first down. And it was very consistently Johnson on the field. So while I typically don't read too much into a single game of short yardage or goal line usage, in this game, because it was such a high sample size and because there was the change in offensive coordinator, it seems like this is something that is more likely to be sticky over the next several weeks of Johnson getting those short yardage snaps. So Johnson had that short touchdown run. Swift needed to break a long run in order to score a touchdown this week. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's going to be harder for Swift to score touchdowns, and we see Johnson take some touchdowns away from Swift in future weeks. So Johnson, probably not someone I'm prioritizing too highly off the waiver wire, unless you're in a league where you can start 3 running backs or something like that. But outside of that, I think Swift could very well lose touchdowns. The other interesting thing to see here was at tight end, I had made a very big deal in the offseason about Gerald Everett being on the team, and Everett having worked with Shane Waldron, both with the Rams as well as with the Seahawks, and now again with the Bears. And we had seen it play out in week 1, where Everett was the primary tight end, running the most routes, seeing the most snaps. Slowly but surely over time, Cole Kmet gained the clear majority of snaps, but Everett was still seeing double-digit snaps each game, at least 14 snaps in every game prior to this week, at least running 7 routes before this week. Now that Shane Waldron is no longer the offensive coordinator, Everett's guy is no longer there. Everett was only on the field for 8 plays in this game, only ran 1 route. Cole Kmet, on the other hand, was on the field for 70 of 72 plays, so playing a lot, or at least a little bit more than what we've seen throughout the entire season, more like what we've seen at his peak at times in past seasons. Kmet running a route on 34 of 39 snaps, so that was also great to see. Didn't have the greatest receiving game in the world, 3 catches for 42 yards. Caleb Williams has been throwing a lot to the wide receivers, especially in recent weeks. So Cole Kmet, someone who had 2 great games so far this season, and the rest of the games you would have rather not had him in your fantasy lineup. But I do think now that the Bears have changed offensive coordinators, there is at least a somewhat higher chance that Cole Kmet can be a fantasy viable tight end at some point this season, but he's going to need that higher target share to get there. Wouldn't be surprised if we see Everett see even fewer snaps in the future. Mercedes Lewis playing a little bit more than usual, roughly around his usual role, but we could see another tight end come up off the practice squad or something like that if the Bears decide they want to make a change, because even when Everett was playing early in the season with Shane Waldron at offensive coordinator, Everett was not all that effective at tight end. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there, but generally good news for Cole Kmet, good news for Roshan Johnson, not great news for Swift, not great news for Everett. So that's going to pretty much cover it for the recap this week. A couple of housekeeping notes. One, I am on Blue Sky. If you have migrated over there, I've seen a ton of fantasy football analysts throughout the industry also make their way to Blue Sky throughout the week. It seems like there's always a couple more each day that are showing up there. So if you do want to find me on Blue Sky, I am there, PFF Nate Jahnke. Also, throughout the week, a pretty usual schedule for me. The podcast wise, I will be on the waiver podcast on Tuesday, like usual. Definitely some interesting names there, particularly at tight end, but also at running back, a couple of names to keep in mind. So I'll be on that with John. John will have his usual IDP show for tomorrow morning, as well as later in the week, and start sit with Nick Bodiford on Thursday as well. In terms of written content, we'll have waivers up in the morning, have recaps to all 12 games up on the website right now. So if you want to go over anything that I talked about today or any of the other games that I didn't cover today, I covered all 12 games in detail and what that means for fantasy football going forward. We'll have the top 10 recap up tomorrow, Monday Night Football recap tomorrow as well. We'll no longer have the 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high because the trade deadline has passed in so many leagues. So putting that article on ice for the year, should be back for next year. But we'll have rest of season rankings up on Tuesday. We'll have rankings up as well on Tuesday like usual. Starts at later in the week. And also, if you want more information on not just the routes run or the participation of the players this week, but want to know more about the grades, want to look back to previous weeks at how well players did or how their playing time has been over time, you can get a PFF Plus subscription and look at our premium stats where we have all that information, as well as how well the players played. We have the grades for all the players, as we always do. So you definitely want a PFF Plus subscription for that. And that is also how you access my rankings, which are some of the most accurate rankings in the fantasy football industry, as well as some of my articles like the waiver article or the start sit article. So I think that pretty much covers everything. Hopefully everyone out there is winning their fantasy matchup. Hopefully you don't have to stress too much about Monday Night Football. And with that, peace out.